Tonight on Nation to Nation, a new report aims to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
Enough is enough. Our people, the statistics have not substantially changed, so we can continue with the pattern we're doing right now, or we can be bold and courageous and actually communicate.
The Royal Bank of Canada is holding its annual General Assembly. This year, pipeline opponents had a limited chance to speak.
The chair was very aggressive in smothering any question that they didn't want to engage.
And we'll hear from a nutritionist about food insecurity caused by climate change.
We need land to plant food. We need land that has, is got integrity so that animals can migrate across it.
Anine, welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. The British Columbia First Nations Justice Council wants to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. The result is a report that heard from 17 communities throughout BC. It reflects the needs and priorities of Indigenous communities and builds on the many reports already available, including the national inquiries, calls for justice. Corey Wilson is the chair of the BCFNJC. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
The Indigenous Women Justice Plan is calling for social, legal, and policing reforms to help reduce violence and harms to Indigenous women and girls. What are some of the changes this report is asking for?
Well, overall, it's a report that's aimed at it. First off, I just want to acknowledge all of the people that contributed to the report. We did extensive engagement around the province. Over the year, we've talked to all kinds of Indigenous people. We've talked to government. We've talked to organizations. And it's very important to recognize that this plan comes from the voice of those people. So it's reflective of the needs and the desires and the wants of the community, and an actual, the consideration of what will actually make a difference for Indigenous people. And I think overall, it's a strategy that is it's about not just, we know there's many reports out there, many, great reports with all kinds of recommendations, and we were also informed by those reports, but we came up with what we hope will be a plan that will be implemented and truly actioned.
How can the justice system be reformed? Can you give some examples where the system is failing Indigenous women and girls?
Well, I think we could just say everywhere, every part of the system. Sadly, I think that's the sad reality. It is the reality that we face today in Canada, that Indigenous women are at the negative end and at the worst end of every indicator in the criminal justice system, not even just in that, in life, generally, poverty and the issues and challenges facing Indigenous women. But the reality is over 50% of the women incarcerated in Canada are Indigenous, and 100% of those women have been sexually assaulted in some way or have faced some level of violence. So that in itself, it's no wonder some of these things happen and these challenges happen. But what is really needed is we need to work together. So we need to work with those actors and players in the criminal justice system, just as we need to work with the brilliant, Native Court Workers and Counseling Association. We need to work with friendship centers. We need to work with the restorative justice programs that happen in this country. We need to work with all levels of governments and all ministries to make sure Indigenous women have the tools and the skills and the abilities that they need to take charge of their life and to keep their children out of care and to follow their dreams.
The report also suggests access to safety, transportation, and cellular connectivity. How can this objective be achieved?
Well, this is, it's quite silly in a way. We know Canada's the second largest country in the world. Canada's a wealthy country as well. If you can have a cellular connection or whatever kind of connection they call it for the people who are up at the space station, you can't tell me you can't have cellular connection across Canada in the rural and remote communities, particularly that Indigenous people live in. We know, again, the vastness of Canada and the distance between our reserves and our communities, but also there's no excuse for the fact that many Indigenous people don't have access to internet or cell phones in urban environments because they simply can't afford it, and they don't have a home computer, they don't have what they need. So I think it's the responsibility of all of the telecom companies and communities that their wires and their fiber optic things, I apologize, I don't know exactly the proper terminology, are going across our country. That is where an Indigenous people should, by rights, have access to reliable cellular networks and internet.
A long-term funding stream is also suggested to help with costs associated with searching for a loved one. How could this be achieved as well?
Well, again, it's everybody coming together to work together to, we know there's pockets of incredible work going on across the country, but we don't talk to each other. We don't collaborate with each other. We don't communicate enough, whether that's between provinces, whether that's between levels of governance, whether that's between First Nations and Indigenous and Métis and Inuit communities. Whatever those connections are, we need to make sure that we establish them and that we need to work together. None of us have enough money to do the work that truly needs to be done to make a systemic change and differences for every single Indigenous person, but together we're stronger. So if we work together and we leverage our resources and we make all of the places and spaces that all of us occupy, that's how we're going to make that difference. But we have to come to the table with open hearts and a real willingness to want to make systemic change and to make an actual difference, because we know how to do it, but we just haven't done it.
There's currently a red dress alert being studied by a parliamentary committee here in Ottawa. It'd be similar to an amber alert system. What's your thoughts on a red dress alert system?
Well, the reality is that anytime any Indigenous person or any Indigenous woman, particularly, or girl or 2S plus person needs help, needs support, goes missing, they must be taken seriously. But that having a red dress alert, absolutely supportive of that. But at the same time, the regular system of Amber Alert and policing and community safety officers have to take Indigenous concerns seriously as well. We shouldn't have to have a red dress system, which again, absolutely supportive of that. But if I'm calling about my Indigenous daughter, calling the regular 911 or police, they need to take that just as seriously as they take those alerts from other people as well. So we can't just offload this stuff. We need to make sure the current systems and current structures are actually responsive to Indigenous people. We need to rid them of the systemic and inherent racism that is in those systems, and we need to hold people accountable for serving or making making different choices depending on the color of someone's skin.
The report was made with feedback from communities in British Columbia, but could the reforms easily be adopted elsewhere in Canada?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that as Indigenous people, we all want our children to succeed, our grandchildren to succeed, our nations to succeed. So absolutely, we've created, BC is the most diverse province in Canada, Indigenous province. In terms of Indigenous people in Canada, we're incredibly diverse. So we have looked at this and we've come up and stuck to the solutions and stuck to the desires of what people want. How it is implemented and how it is rolled out doesn't have to be Kwakwaka'wakw specific or Salish specific. There's no reason it can't go all the way across the country to our brothers and sisters in the eastern, to the Algonquin, to the north, to wherever. So the issues are the same. We know the issues are the same. The challenges are the same. The desires to make change are the same. How it actually gets rolled out is something. It doesn't have to look exactly the same, but what we need to do is have a set of foundations that's founded on truth, founded on reality, and founded on the intent to truly make action and make systemic change.
Okay, miigwech. Thank you, Corey Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't go away. Right after the break, I'll speak with Grand Chief Stuart Phillip about RBC's financial support of big oil. Ani, welcome back. The Royal Bank of Canada has long been criticized as one of the biggest financiers of the oil and gas industry globally, including the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia, which some Wet'suwet'en and hereditary chiefs tried to put a stop to. Today, land defenders are gathered at the RBC's annual general meeting in Etobicoke. Chief Stuart Phillip is the Grand Chief of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. He's in attendance at today's meeting. He joins me now. Welcome, Chief Phillip.
Good afternoon.
At last year's RBC events in Saskatoon, delegates were apparently manhandled and segregated amid increased police surveillance and private security. This year, RBC has changed its approach to engagement. What made RBC change its policy to include UNDRIP?
Well, I think that the bad publicity that they attracted with respect to the spectacle last year of a ridiculous level of security, and there was actual police officers observed on the roof of adjacent buildings and so on and so forth. People were denied into the main room. They were forced into a room without windows or a monitor. Today, it was somewhat different in that regard. Security was evident, but they weren't as aggressive. But nonetheless, the tone of the meeting was very overbearing. People were only given a minute, which is a ridiculously short amount of time to make statements or to ask questions. And the chair was very aggressive in smothering any question that they didn't want to engage. They would say, that question has been dealt with. We don't need to offer any further responses. So it was, very repressive and disrespectful to people that had traveled a great distance to participate in that forum.
What was the message that you were able to tell at this meeting?
Well, I think it was time well invested, given the number of delegates that did show up in terms of promoting the issue that RBC and other banking institutions need to understand the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has been legislated both federally and provincially is a reality that must be dealt with, and the banking community needs to operationalize free, prior, and informed consent in their decisions in regard to large-scale resource development that jeopardizes the integrity of the environment, riparian systems, and wildlife habitats, and so on.
Would you deem this meeting a success in comparison to what has happened at other meetings?
Well, I think this is, a long-term campaign. I believe that as we move forward and the climate crisis intensifies, and there's even greater destruction of the forests, for example, and river systems, and in regard to drought and crop failures, the damages accruing in regard to the loss of hundreds of homes, that the bank will have to acquiesce and know and understand that unless they take UNDRIP seriously and free, prior, and informed consent seriously, we're going to move to a very litigious reality in regard to these large-scale projects.
Is it your hopes to get RBC out of the oil and gas industry?
It's an issue of the UN Declaration and gives us the right to say no. And certainly governments and industry don't want to accept that fact. We want to have the ability to offer our own expertise in the evaluations of these projects, and in the event it has unacceptable levels of risk and damage to the environment, then it's incumbent upon us to not approve that particular application.
How do you feel even after so much First Nations opposition, a project like the TMX pipeline is nearing completion?
Well, I think that the TMX is a prime example, along with Coastal Gas, how not to undertake a project. Had those companies at that time had UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples available to them and respected free, prior, and informed consent, I don't think you would have saw the billions upon billions of dollars wasted on cost overruns and opposition and so on in regard to those projects. TMX is north of $30 billion. Trudeau bought that pipeline for $4 billion. The Coastal Gas Link had enormous cost overruns also. Somebody's paying. It's the Canadian taxpayer that's picking up the bill for those cost overruns. Trudeau unilaterally declared TMX in the national interest. So it was virtually an open checkbook.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. We'll hear from a nutritionist about climate change and how it is creating food insecurity. Anine, welcome back. Climate change increases food insecurity, it alters weather patterns, reduces agricultural productivity, and disrupts ecosystems. Indigenous communities are significantly affected as traditional food sources essential to Indigenous diets and cultural practices are threatened by environmental changes. Dr. Trina Delorme is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Food Sovereignty at McGill University. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation, Trina.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What is food insecurity?
Oh, well, when we talk about food insecurity, usually people will characterize what it means to be food secure. So usually that means having access to nutritious food for living a healthy life, having access, but also having availability to it and being able to know how to use that food. And there's a stability component to it, that this thing it's not temporary, that there's a certainty to its carrying on. So when you're not food secure, there's risk and uncertainty in where you get your food, if you can access that, and when you can access those foods, are they things that you know how to use, and that stability component to it as well is in question.
How will climate change, or how does climate change affect food security?
Well, if we're talking about food security globally for everyone, we can imagine that changes in climate that are affecting transportation systems, either through extreme weather events that can interrupt transport chains for food security. But often with Indigenous peoples, we're concerned about the food systems that we use that traditionally or historically were tied to our territories and our lands. So, Indigenous peoples were able to eat very nutritious, high quality diets from knowing how to have balanced relationships with the animals and plant life around them. And so soon as ecosystems are impacted by climate change, that changes aspects of the food system, migration patterns, availability of plants. Is soil being, is it being, flooded with salt water? All of these things that happen with climate changes can affect ecosystems, which affect Indigenous people's food systems, and hence will affect their traditional food security.
And how has this affected Indigenous people's health?
Well, generally, to be food security is this idea that you have access to healthy food. So we need to have healthy food, for healthy growth and development, to prevent chronic diseases, to keep children healthy. So if we don't have access to a secure and healthy food system, that will impact health. But we also know that being food insecure, primarily when it's measured by asking people if they had enough money to buy food, that kind of food insecurity also impacts mental health. But if we are thinking about, food security coming from our food systems that historically, like I talked about, traditional food systems, these are, so central to identity. We have relationships with animals and plants and our relational way of seeing ourselves in the world. And we take care of these things so that they can take care of us and provide us nutrition. So when we don't have access to these traditional foods and our traditional food systems and lands, it affects people's mental health from a cultural perspective, but it also impacts social relationships.
What more is needed to help with food insecurity and Indigenous health?
Well, in big picture, when I think about this, and if we think about what could change to improve the food security status of Indigenous peoples, and I'm saying that because we know from research that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, and Inuit, there tends to be more research on that, but also Métis, is that there's higher food insecurity rates in these populations. And that's due to socioeconomic status, primarily not having enough income. And that's usually linked to not having opportunities for employment or education. So this is not, these are social determinants of health. So we need to, improve income and livable wages generally for food security. That's what research is telling us. But for Indigenous peoples, we need to take into consideration that, the income disparities, the differences that we see in income between Indigenous populations and Canadian populations. But also what's really key is land. We need land to plant food. We need land that's has, is got integrity so that animals can migrate across it, so that plants can continue to grow on it, so that ecosystems can be balanced in it. And, having land is a huge issue in Canada because we, as Indigenous peoples, have access to very little of it. And we need that for food security and for self-determination.
Is there an Indigenous community that, in your opinion, is well on its way to dealing with these challenges? What are they doing?
Well, I know of examples of communities that have made food security a priority. So I think that's one thing, it has to be identified as something the community is willing to work on, to invest resources in. So those usually are examples of successful programs. When communities have identified the issue, when communities are involved, leadership is involved, and Indigenous knowledge holders are involved. And what we've seen is some pretty promising examples when partnering with researchers in the kind of research that both Indigenous knowledge holders and researchers are equal, that we value each other's contributions equally. So partnerships in research have been useful in, working to find solutions.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech.
Thank you, Annette. Nyawa.
That's it for tonight's Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech and have a good night.